Hello, and welcome to Boston's North End, home of all things that end in "oli," "oni," and "ah." These days, the North End is a bustling hub of Italian food, as well as a locale rich in American history, especially pertaining to the American Revolution and Paul Revere. But for today, we're going to jump to January 1919. 1919 was a tough year for the country. We were dealing with the tail end of the Great Influenza and had just come out of the Great War. But this neighborhood had its own great event, too. The Great Molasses Flood. 1919 was actually pretty terrible for a time when everything was called great. On January 15th, 1919, the weather was unseasonably warm. Temperatures reached the 40s, and it was sunny, so people in the North End were outside enjoying the day. Around lunchtime, children could be seen collecting firewood, and workers on break were enjoying lunch in the sunshine. But the beauty of the day turned to tragedy at 12:30 p.m. when a loud crash pierced the air and a 40-foot wave of viscosity overtook the unsuspecting residents and workers in the neighborhood. A 50-foot high, 200-foot in diameter tank containing 2.5 million gallons of black strap molasses exploded, sending a 40-foot wave of hot, sticky syrup all over Boston's North End at a speed of about 36 miles per hour, crushing everything in its path. Train tracks were twisted, buildings were razed, vehicles and animals were swept away. While the mild temperatures of the day allowed for the swift movement of the molasses initially, the January night air resulted in the hardening of the substance, further trapping its victims and adding a substantial layer of difficulty to the recovery efforts. By the time the recovery efforts had concluded, 21 bodies had been found and 150 more people had been injured. The injuries ranged from broken bones to brain damage. It took months to find all of the victims, and the smell of molasses lingered in the city for decades. Cleanup took about 87,000 man-hours. The odor of molasses could be detected across the entire city. Death by molasses might sound pretty funny, but honestly, it's actually horrific. The crushing weight of millions of gallons of the substance aside, several of the deaths were caused by asphyxiation. The molasses was so thick that it blocked the airways of its victims, causing them to drown in the stuff. Bridget Clottery died when her house collapsed under the wave of molasses flooding her North End home. Her son Stephen died months later at the Boston State Asylum for the Insane as a result of his injuries. James McMullen, a railway foreman, died days after the flood from internal injuries and infection. Blacksmith John Sieberlich died from a fractured skull and other injuries after being crushed by debris while working near the ruptured storage tank. Patrick Breen, a laborer, died from pneumonia and internal injuries after being swept into Boston Harbor. William Brogan, a teamster, was unable to escape while working at the City of Boston's North End paving yard, which was adjacent to the doomed USIA storage tank. Following the tragedy, the company that had built the tank insisted that the explosion was caused by Italian anarchists, which coming out of World War I was a real concern for people. They went all in on this accusation, claiming that a threat had been phoned in a year earlier and stated that a bomb had been planted at another USIA facility in 1916. This, however, was an attempt to save face in what would become a PR disaster. The tank had been built in the neighborhood in 1914, and the Italian immigrants and Irish Americans who lived there were wary of it well before the explosion occurred. Owned by a subsidiary of U.S. Industrial Alcohol, the tank was used to store molasses before being sent to a distillery in East Cambridge, where it was turned into industrial-grade alcohol, or ethanol. Choosing to put the tank in this neighborhood was strategic. Poor immigrants were less likely to oppose it through any viable legal or political means. The USIA was well aware of the structural issues with the vat from the start. Leaks were reported so frequently in its 5 years of existence that the USIA took to painting the tank dark brown in an effort to hide the evidence. Enterprising families actually took advantage of the leaks and collected the molasses to bring home. The residents, who knew that the tank had been faulty all along, fought back. They ultimately saw justice of a sort in 1925 when the USIA was found liable for the disaster and was ordered to pay $600,000 to the victims' families. Evidence showed that the tank was built hastily using flimsy materials. For reference, $600,000 in 1925 is equal to about $8.9 million today. As a result of the disaster, industries are held to much more stringent guidelines today, including the need for building plans to be signed off on by an architect and filed with the local building department before construction can begin. While the tank was never rebuilt, a plaque has been placed near the site of the disaster. It reads, "On January 15, 1919, a molasses tank at 529 Commercial Street exploded under pressure, killing 21 people. A 40-foot wave of molasses buckled the elevated railroad tracks, crushed buildings, and inundated the neighborhood. Structural defects in the tank combined with unseasonably warm temperatures contributed to the disaster." For decades after the disaster, people claimed that they could smell molasses in the air, particularly on hot summer days. People still claim as much today, but those people are just near a bakery.